Hey guys, welcome back to Research Unpacked from Informed Performance. I'm Alistair McKenzie, a sports physiotherapist from the UK. In our Research Unpacked episodes, we look to bring you short and sharp research reviews from a variety of researchers to help you stay up to date with relevant research in sports performance and medicine. On today's episode, I'm happy to bring you the third and final episode in the three-part series with Dr Andras Hegyi. Over the last two episodes, Andras and myself have been discussing in great depth his research around regional muscle activation in the hamstrings during a variety of different exercises, with some excellent clinical implications and perspectives towards injury prevention and sports performance. If you haven't already, I urge you to listen back to parts 1 and 2 with Andras, as they provide the background leading up to today's paper, which is all about Nordics.
This episode of the Informed Performance podcast has been sponsored by Vol Performance, makers of the Force Frame. Used by health and performance professionals for assessing and improving performance and rehabilitation, the Force Frame is a powerful solution for quickly and accurately testing isometric strength and imbalances. In addition to testing athletes, the Force Frame is also used to maintain and improve strength, offering over 130 isometric training protocols. As a portable and easy-to-use system, the Force Frame is designed to ensure every measurement can be accurately and reliably measured, time after time again. To learn more about the Force Frame, visit our sponsor, volperformance.com. But for now, here's the episode with Alistair and Andras Hegyi.
Okay, Andras, thanks for coming back on for part 3 and discussing the final paper in this series, which is all things Nordics. A hot topic, it has been for a while, especially regarding injury prevention. So I'm really looking forward to hearing you talk about this paper in depth. So yeah, how did this paper come into existence, mate?
Yeah, so the idea was to go a little deeper into Nordic hamstring exercise. It's definitely a great starting point because we see many papers showing that the injury risk decreases quite a lot after a Nordic hamstring exercise intervention. But there are also some criticizing voices towards Nordic hamstring exercise. So basically, one is that the operating length of the hamstrings is relatively short in the Nordic hamstring exercise, and there are some studies which show that if you apply exercises at longer muscle lengths, that can actually be more advantageous for injury prevention. So that's one problem that we usually hear, and the other is that mechanically we see lots of differences in how people perform Nordic hamstring exercise. And here I think about hip position, for example. So the instruction usually is that you extend your hip while performing the exercise. But in practice, what we see many times is that there is a considerable hip flexion for some athletes, and for others, it's relatively more extended. So there was just a study like a week ago came out, and it showed that like the range between individuals was like 0 to 45 degrees in thigh to trunk angle. So it's highly individual how much you flex your hip. And it's hard to say if it's robust between sessions. So if you have an athlete and you want to follow up the athlete, then you don't know, there is not much data on that. So we don't know if the athlete will perform the same way, the exercise. And this might affect the outcome you measure. And another problem is that the knee range of motion is usually not controlled, or at least we put a lot of load on the athlete so that the athlete cannot perform the exercise in the full range of motion, but we focus on an eccentric overload on the hamstrings rather than doing the exercise in the full range of motion, which might be a good idea from one perspective, but the other part is that the intramuscular distribution may change with knee range of motion, as we see from studies using dynamometer. So, and just another point that we wanted to target is to see if we have similar outcomes based on like torque and Emg in a bilateral and unilateral Nordic hamstring exercise.
Yeah, they're all interesting points and show the complexity associated with the application of the Nordic, especially around technique and standards of technique, which with a lot of data around injury prevention being longitudinal, you can kind of see how these factors may relate to the variety in data around its effectiveness in injury prevention and some of the challenges around longitudinal and interventional studies. But in this study, you looked purely observationally to infer some of the potential mechanistic responses to different variations of the exercise. And so which variations did you look at?
So basically, we had 4 different Nordic hamstring exercise modes. One is Nordic hamstring exercise with extended hips bilaterally. Then another one is Nordic hamstring exercise with extended hips unilaterally. So it was performed only with one leg. And then these 2 were also performed with hips flexed to 90 degrees. To do this, we used a novel load cell device called the Hamtech. So it allows you to have more control over the hip angle, and basically to have more control on the knee range of motion, we used elastic bands. Although this machine also has like a pneumatic system to like decrease the load, but we used the elastic bands. And basically, what was a step forward from the previous study is that we matched the relative load as well, but we went up to eccentric 1 repetition maximum. So it was the highest load they could do for the full range of motion, which I should mention it was not full because we ended at 15 degrees of knee flexion at a 5-second pace. So we also matched the pace of the movement. And we measured basically the force at the ankles, just like in other Nordic hamstring devices. And we also measured the activation of the muscles with high density Emg from the biceps, femoris, and semitendinous muscles, just like in the previous studies.
Yeah, cool. It's clear that you've tried to account for some of the issues outlined, and it sounds like you tried to replicate what the conventional Nordic hamstring exercise was designed to be, and or certainly what's attempted to be an application, being supramaximal eccentric only, 1 rep max, or full and near full range of movement at the knee, and a controlled tempo and hip angle. Then with the added variations of the 90-degree hip to see what the difference is in outcomes between longer and shorter muscle lengths at similar loads, right?
Yes, you could say so.
So for me, I guess my first question was around the Nordic hamstring at 90 degrees, or the NHE 90. You said that you were able to match the relative load using the Hamtech to a 1 rep max. So did you have to add more load to this one as you lose some of the moment arm compared to the extended hip variations? Yeah,
that's exactly right. So with the NAG 90, or when the hips were flexed to 90 degrees, we had quite a lot of plates. So you could fix these weight plates on the frame of the device. So the subjects didn't need to hold the device, but it was placed on the frame or they didn't need to hold the weights. It was placed on the frame of the device, but it was much higher than in the NAGO. So when the hips were extended, because of the lower moment arm in NAG 90.
Yeah, and that's interesting because you mentioned earlier that there's been recorded a large variance in hip angle between individuals associated with the technique, which may be associated with strength levels, as some athletes potentially have to compensate by flexing the hip during the exercise to shorten the moment arm and therefore reduce the demands of the exercise.
Yeah, exactly. So you can go to a more extended knee position if you flex your hip because of this moment arm decrease in moment arm, and that's what we see many times.
Yeah, so let's jump into what some of your findings were then, mate. And I guess with the addition of torque or measuring torque, should we start there?
Sure. So with the torque, we found a larger torque in the Nag 90. So when the hips were flexed to 90 degrees, the torque was much larger, especially in the first half of the movement. So from the start to 87% of the movement, and then around peak torque, so close to extended knee position, it was quite similar between the two exercises. But it's again important to mention that the relative load was matched, so we had much more weight on the frame when the hips were flexed, and this was the only way to reach the same peak torque. But when you perform the exercise with body weight only, as we mentioned before, the torque will be lower when you flex your hip at the same knee position, at least.
Yeah, and that's an important point, I guess, to interpret these findings and apply them clinically. You should consider adding external load if you're going to try and perform the Nordic with a hip flexion at 90 to get these higher torque values, which are a compensation of the reduced moment arm. So maybe hypothetically, if an athlete's struggling to maintain an extended hip angle but can perform multiple reps, I may give them some additional load to increase the demands of the exercise and subsequent adaptations. So what about the difference between bilateral and unilateral?
So it was quite similar between bilateral and unilateral NAGO. When we performed with extended hip, there was a small difference in the mid region of the muscle, but it was not evident in muscle activation, and it was quite a small difference. So overall, what I can say is that we probably gain, or it's probably quite the same for the hamstrings to perform unilaterally or bilaterally, but it's still interesting after, for example, if you have a hamstring injury and you have large imbalance between the legs, then it might be interesting to target the injured side. Otherwise, you compensate with the other leg.
Yeah, so fairly similar muscle activation and torque patterns between the bilateral and unilateral. I've got to say, I've never seen a unilateral Nordic performed, not on Instagram or in my practice. I've certainly seen a lot of single leg glute ham raises and 45-degree raises and stuff like that performed with regards to hamstrings, but never a single leg Nordic. So I might have to give that a try next time I'm in the gym, before I give it to any of the lads. But, on that, just briefly, I know you went through quite a rigorous familiarization period with these guys, because a Nordic hamstring exercise is difficult as it is, let alone these variations, let alone a true 1 rep max supramaximal eccentric load. So that was a really important component of your research, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we had 6 sessions to get familiar with these exercises, which was quite important for us, because even though we perform this exercise on this device, which helps you to extend your hip in the NAGO, it was still difficult for some of the athletes, and they actually had to learn how to perform the exercise with focusing on a hip extension effort during the Nordic hamstring exercise. So that was the main reason why we really wanted a proper familiarization.
Yeah, and that resonates with me clinically. Applying the Nordics to groups, they have to have a good history or be familiar with the exercise to execute it. It's not just a case of, adding some Nordics in. If they've never done it before, they're going to really struggle. So with my cohorts, we have quite a few variations and progressions before you get to a full bodyweight Nordic, because we want the technique there. So like you're saying, with the knee hip flexion angle might be an interesting way to offload them a little bit to get used to demand, and then you can go through a familiarization of that and slowly progress them through. So I've certainly, when reading this and discussing it with you, there's some little clinical things that are triggering in my head there, how I can apply this information. So it's really useful. Yeah, so that was brilliant. And then the next bit, I guess, was the EMG, the muscle activity. So what kind of things did you observe there?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, between bilateral and unilateral, we found no differences. But between the NAGO and NAG90, there were quite large differences, especially in the second half of the movement. So when we performed with extended hip, then the activation was much higher than when we performed with flexed hip position. So basically, when we combine the results from torque and EMG, we can see that basically the ratio between torque and EMG is much higher in the NAG90. So when you flex your hips to 90 degrees, than when you perform the exercise with extended hip. So there might be two reasons why this happens. One, of course, there might be other muscles contributing to the two tasks. That's one we should mention, because we measured only two muscles basically. But it is very likely that you also load the passive structures a bit more when you flex your hip to 90 degrees. And it is also possible that the fascicles work more eccentrically in this exercise than in the traditional Nordic hamstring exercise. So there is a recent study which measured fascicle behavior in the biceps femoris using ultrasonography during the Nordic hamstring exercise performed with extended hips. And what they found is that the fascicles worked eccentrically only around peak torque, and before that, it was more like isometric. So it may be that we have more eccentric work in the NAG90, which might be interesting from an injury prevention perspective. Because usually we want some eccentric load on the hamstring to increase fascicle length, potentially add sarcomeres in series, and then the muscle can absorb more energy in the late swing phase of sprinting.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and some good key points there to underline some of the potential mechanisms contributing to that change. So the Nordic at 90 produces more torque but less muscle activation, potentially due to the role of other muscles like the adductor or the semi-mem, but also potentially due to contraction dynamics, so working at longer fascicle lengths. And I'm just imagining the force length curve at the moment with the contribution of more passive or non-contractile structures. As the fascicle length increases, things like tendon, fascia may be influenced in contributing force. And then, yeah, from a clinical perspective, we can potentially assume that the hip flexion angle creates more of an eccentric orientated fascicle load, which we then use as our kind of guideline to stimulate more of anatomical adaptation at that level, which may be important with regards to preventing injuries during sprinting. And it's really interesting that you bring up other research that looks at the behavior of fascicles during the Nordic, and I'll have to get that reference from you and put it on the show notes for our listeners. But if we're moving on with this study, we've discussed overall muscle activity. What about between muscle and regional activity?
So in the Nordic hamstring exercise performed with 90 degrees hip flexion, we had higher activation in the semitendinosus than in the biceps femoris in the whole range of motion. But when we had the hips extended, then we had a more equal distribution between the muscles when we compared, like we averaged the whole range of motion. But what was also interesting is that the intermuscular distribution actually changed through the range of motion. So using statistical parametric mapping, we took advantage of the high temporal resolution of the EMG signal. So we could compare the early phase to the late phase of the exercise. And we found higher activation in the semitendinosus than in the biceps femoris in the early phase, so close to a flexed knee position. But in close to an extended position, we had higher activation in the biceps femoris than in the semitendinosus muscle. So when we compare these two previous studies, although we have some contradictory results, most of the studies show that the activation is higher in the semitendinosus than in the biceps femoris in the Nordic hamstring exercise. This is what is generally accepted, but this is not exactly what we see here. So one reason might be is that here we have almost full range of motion, and in most other studies, the load is supramaximal, so the athletes cannot go close to knee extension, where the biceps femoris would be activated relatively more. This might be one reason, and the other is that, as we mentioned before, we had lots of familiarization sessions to extend the hip, to focus on a hip extension effort in the Nordic hamstring exercise. And there is an interesting review from Matt Bourne, who summarized some of the MRI studies, functional MRI studies, and he showed that if you have a hip extension, then it may favor biceps femoris as compared to knee flexion. So it may be that this hip extension effort also brings biceps femoris more into this movement. And also in our recent study, we confirmed that if you have a combined knee flexion and hip extension as compared to knee flexion only, then you have higher activation in the biceps femoris muscle, but not in the semitendinosus muscle.
Yeah, really interesting, and what he's saying is really that technique matters as it influences the muscle activation. And if we want to target the biceps femoris, which is a common goal in injury prevention and rehab, as it's the most injured site, I need to progress or at least work on progressing to a Nordic through a full range of motion with an added hip extension effort, to increase the likelihood of targeting that specific area. But also the intent and coaching of the Nordic is really important. And there's lots of barriers associated with that, especially in football, that have been discussed in the research, being a supramaximal exercise associated with more muscle soreness. And like you said, the individual between session variation of the execution of the task. So yeah, for me, it's just highlighting a lot of complexity associated with the application of this exercise. And it's not as simple as applying Nordics will reduce hamstring injury risk, which is the common theme as discussed, and that's being challenged. So the more specific or concise we get with the definition and the execution of a Nordic, maybe it will help with the research and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's exactly right. If you want to preferentially target biceps femoris, but again, it's cross-sectional, and we always need to keep this in mind, that it sounds very sexy, but we really need the intervention studies to understand what is clinically meaningful here. And also, I should mention that these between muscle differences were relatively small, even though statistically significant. So it was quite restricted to small range of motion at the end and the beginning. So we definitely need some replication studies to eliminate type 1 errors. But actually, there was one study published very recently from Aurélie Boyer, and they also found the same, so that the distribution of activation changes similar way in this, like in our study. And also this is what we see from studies on dynamometer. So there are a couple of studies now supporting this idea.
Yeah, and like I said, like one of the main reasons I wanted to start this Research Unpacked episode is to get the narratives and the views straight from the authors, because you certainly highlighted a lot of really excellent key points around the research and some of the areas for future research, which again is what good researchers do. They just create more questions, more problems to be answered. So thanks for that, Andras.
Yeah, well, everyone believes that we scientists answer questions, but we actually create problems and questions, more like answering them.
Yeah, well, you're definitely doing your bit, mate.
Yeah, I'm quite good at like doing lots of mess around me.
Yeah, I won't disagree. Andras, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversations, and thank you so much for taking your time out of your busy schedule to discuss your work. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners have as well. I hope you've enjoyed it. But where can people find you to stay up to date with your postdoctoral research? Because I know you've got a lot of great publications to come.
Well, email is probably the easiest to reach me nowadays. I'm also on Twitter, so you can follow me there, even though I'm not super active these days. But I try to post some of the stuff we are doing. And you can also find me on ResearchGate, also on LinkedIn, but I'm not using LinkedIn a lot, so it's not the safest way to contact me.
Fantastic, mate. Thanks again for coming on, and hopefully I'll get you back on the show again when you've created some more problems for us to think about, mate.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Guys, that's it for part 3 with Andras Hegyi. I hope you've enjoyed our first series of Research Unpacked. Please leave any feedback on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter or Instagram. It would be greatly appreciated. Please stay touch for our next episodes, where we have Tim McGrath, an Australian physio, who's going to discuss a whole lot around ACL reconstruction and ACL rehab. So stay tuned for that, and thanks for listening.